Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. I'm Dr. Chris Leib. So today we're going to do another podcast continuing on the theme of continuum-based thinking. And today we're going to discuss something called the consumption continuum. So this will be tied into nutrition, use of supplementation, as well as use of different drugs, whether they're prescription or illicit in nature. And the intention here is, again, to try to take judgment out of the discussion and make it more process oriented in how we think about these factors. Oftentimes, especially when we're talking about things like drugs and food, there's so much judgment that gets tied into the concepts that we don't appreciate that the process involved in making change or identifying certain people as a certain thing, like an addict or something that they cannot change, as opposed to getting somebody involved in a process and appreciating if you want to make a change, it's always a process. So you just got to get started in that process. It's not going to be easy. But if we understand things as a process, we realize that we can always be working on improving ourselves. So just as a review from previous podcasts, defining a continuum, two definitions here. One, a continuous sequence in which adjacent elements are not perceptibly different from each other, although the extremes are quite distinct. So again, when we're talking about judgment, oftentimes we're talking about extreme poles where something is really good or something is really bad. And what we want to do is have an understanding of these concepts as towards better, towards worse, but we also want to understand that better and worse is always within a context of relationships. It's not inherently so. So when we talk about a continuum and when we talk about things like judgment, we have to appreciate that judgment really only exists when something is in relationship to something else. And we don't often talk about it like that. We talk about it as if it was inherently anointed as so, as something is good or something is bad. So what we want to discuss today is, what are these relationships that are always at play? What are these variables that we can manipulate to make something towards better, towards worse, but in a certain circumstance at a certain time, not inherently so for all times? So another definition by Merriam-Webster is a coherent whole characterized as a collection, sequence, or progression of values or elements varying by minute degrees. So again, the minute degrees is important here, is that as we're looking to make changes, we're going to do it gradually over time. So it becomes less perceptible actually over time, but when we look back, we have made quite a bit of progress. And just like we talked about with movement and we talked about with pain, we can also look at when we're trying to make behavioral changes, when it comes to food, when it comes to trying to enhance ourselves with supplementation, or when we're trying to either use pharmacology and drugs in a way that's therapeutic, or if we're having trouble with a dependency towards drugs, how we can look to work our way out of that and back into a more productive life. So the consumption continuum, this is a terminology that I've used to try to group together this idea of what we're putting in our body. So you can think of it as a sequence of variables that represents the utility or the usefulness of various entities consumed by human beings. So three categories of consumption are food or drink, supplementation, and then drugs, whether medical or recreational. And the variables that are going to be put into this continuum or the spectrum are the quantity or dosage, the concentration, which is similar, but especially when we get into drugs is really important and often becomes the thing that can make something lethal. And then we also will look at the likelihood of overconsumption. So those three variables really dictate if something is towards healthy, towards unhealthy, but it's, as you'll see, hopefully as I describe, that it really does depend on the person and the situation and the utility of it at one point in time. So utility versus judgment here. So I alluded to this earlier, but when we look at utility, it's just asking, is something useful for a particular goal? And for a particular goal really matters here. It's not just useful, period. Judgment is something that it's just, we're saying, is it good or bad for you? Again, that actually doesn't exist when we start to look deeper into things. Is nothing is naturally good or bad for you. It has to be in relationship to something else. So the possible goals that we'd be looking at to making something useful or not would be, is it useful for health? Is it useful for entertainment or enjoyment? Is it useful for social reasons? So if we think about those three possible goals, we can really look at some of the things that we would say are unhealthy might be actually useful for social reasons, or might be useful at a particular moment for entertainment and enjoyment, but in the long run might not be useful for health, right? So we have to have a discussion about the utility of anything that we're consuming at any moment. Utility is always based on a relationship between or among various factors. It is in a continuum, not based on inherent factors of an entity, where judgment assumes utility based on the entity itself. And oftentimes you could think of this as judgment makes something a noun, where utility makes it a verb, right? So it's in a process. The verb is something that's an action, where a noun is a thing. All right, so when we look at any of the things we're talking about that are in a continuum, they're not a thing, they're a process, so they're more of a verb than a noun. So if we look at the utility of food and drink, obviously we need energy to fuel our bodily systems, right? And that's really what distinguishes food or drink in my discussion here from supplementation or from drugs, is that we really need this for energy to fuel our bodily systems. We have to have food or drink to live. We especially need water to live more than we even need food, or let's put it this way, we would die sooner without water than we would without food, but we need both to live in the long run. We don't need supplementation to live, and we don't need drugs to live. We may need them to balance out our systems in certain ways, and we'll talk about that later. But for the dissociation of the factors here, we're looking at food and drink as these things that we need for energy to fuel our bodily systems, but we can also utilize food or drink for enjoyment. And then we have to take into account short-term versus long-term considerations. And oftentimes in the discussion and the judgment about food being healthy or unhealthy, the healthy food tend to be the things that we're taking into account long-term considerations over short-term enjoyment or short-term considerations. But that's not necessarily better or worse. That's just a relationship. So again, it's in the short term, there's no problem with saying, I like the taste of something. This is going to enhance my enjoyment in this moment. Obviously, if we have no mindfulness of the process later on, that could lead to overconsumption, and that could become a problem, and that could become unhealthy over time. But eating something that in the short term is delicious, it is enhancing the moment, isn't necessarily unhealthy. And we've sort of distinguished the two now in common language as unhealthy would be short-term enjoyment, and we're not thinking about the long-term consequences. So I think we have to be able to have a discussion that we can balance the two and say, okay, there are times where I'm going to make a decision to enjoy something in the short term, and I'm not going to think about the long-term consequences at this moment, but I'll have another strategy for thinking about long-term consequences. So in that way, we can separate out the judgment and just say that we have multiple strategies at multiple times, and that allows us to exist as a human and try to get more out of life in many ways, have more experiences, as opposed to always judging, I don't want to do the bad ones, I only want to do the good ones. And again, when we break that down, that really doesn't have an inherent meaning. We have to tie it into some other conversation about some other factors. And then we can look at the utility of food and drink. It's going to vary based on a situation and an individual. So very common example, we can look at sugar is a villain right now. And certainly you can overconsume sugar very easily. And it's something that seems to be very prevalent in our society. However, the utility of a simple sugar right before intense exercise can absolutely be pretty necessary and very useful in that moment to fuel our body to do harder things. So again, based on the situation, sugar might be absolutely the thing to use. Something that is quick and easy to digest might be the thing to do in certain moments, but those are also going to be the things that maybe we overconsume with the most ease, which can lead to obesity and metabolic problems down the line. So in certain situations, sugar will be towards unhealthy, and in some situations, it's got a perfect utility for what you need it. So again, we can't have a specific judgment of good or bad. We have to really discuss it based on our needs for that situation and that individual. So if we look at the continuum of food and drink, we're going to look at quantity, concentration, likelihood of overconsumption. So obviously, we can eat too much and we can eat too little. There's polar diagnoses that you could look at is obesity, type 2 diabetes would be in the eat too much category. At least that's a piece of it. It's not the whole thing. And then the too little, the polar diagnosis there would be to look at something like anorexia. So we know about those extremes. And then there's everything in between. And how do we know? Well, we have to be able to measure and monitor things. And again, we have to have relationships that we're discussing. So how do we know we're consuming too much? Well, if we're trying to have a certain weight that ties into certain health markers, then we have to do a little experimentation to say, what is the healthy weight? We could use things that have been studied like BMI as a starting point. And we don't have to get overly caught up in specific numbers, but I think certain numbers that have been studied are a good starting point. If we're way over a BMI that's been studied, let's get ourselves closer to the normal ranges. And those normal ranges are actually pretty large. So it does give you some wiggle room to say, okay, can I just be on the end of that range? Am I close to being underweight where I'm more towards the bottom of that range? So that's a starting point. It doesn't have to be the only one. And I think a lot of times there's a lot of contention around BMI because it doesn't take into account muscle mass and things like that. But if you're way off, maybe that's a start to try to get yourself closer to normal. We could look at, if you want to dive deeper, you can get a DEXA scan. You can look at body fat percentage and things like that. And we have that as a start and see if we can make change to that. And one of the ways we can try to make change to that is to change the quantity of food we're consuming. And when we look at concentration, that's a slightly different way to look at quantity. And it just certainly speaks to what foods are easier to consume and what's at greater quantities, and some foods that are harder to consume at greater quantities. So high nutrient concentration would be there's more nutrients, less calories. So a very obvious example is a green leafy vegetable, where it's actually hard to eat a lot of it and there's not a lot of calories. It's very water-based. So foods that have a lot of water content, but might also have a lot of nutrients, they give us what we need. But when we eat a lot of them, we feel pretty satiated, and we actually haven't put a lot of calories in our body. The other side of that would be something could be high calorie or high energy. So we get more calories, more energy in something that is a smaller quantity or something that's easier to consume. And there might be less nutrients. That's not always true. Usually more easily digestible. So simple sugars, drinking your sugar, right? So having soda, having some type of fluid that has a lot of sugar in it, it's usually easy to consume. And if we look at how much we've consumed, it's more calories than we might have expected because it went down so easy. And we can look at oils that way too, where if we look at just like 10 milliliters of olive oil, we can't say it's good or bad for you. And typically it's said it's good. But like if we were to look at how much energy and how much caloric load is in about 10 milliliters of oil, it's quite a bit of calories for such a small amount. So that's what we're looking at. And again, this is not a judgment for good or bad, but you can look at some of these things that are high calorie, high energy. They're easier to overconsume. So the concentration of calories is greater, but some of these foods could be very healthy. They can give you really quick energy. Oils, simple sugars tend to fall into this. Processed foods tend to fall into this category where we are easily able to consume them at greater quantities, and our body's not able to really give us signals that we're satiated or we're full. But in the right moments, these things could absolutely be what we need. And for those that actually need to gain weight, and I'm seeing this a lot more with clients that are taking these weight loss drugs, which are actually been really helpful for them, but they have to find ways to continue to get calories in, with especially protein. Sometimes you want stuff that might be a little bit more processed, a little bit easier to digest, because they're getting signals of satiation from the medicine that they wouldn't be getting if they weren't taking the medicine. So these high calorie, high energy concentrated foods might actually be more of the solution, have more utility for them in those moments. Same thing with those that are just naturally a little bit underweight, they might have issues with bone density. They need a little bit more calories to put some mass on to get a little bit more load through their bones. And oftentimes, again, to get a little bit more of the macronutrients, such as protein, that will help build muscle. That's not always easy for people. And we take for granted that a good majority of our population is overweight. So we always think about health food in the realm of what makes it harder to eat more. But there are people that need to eat more, and we have to sort of flip our logic then and looking at what is useful for those individuals. And there's quite a few of them, right? So I think, again, we have such a bias towards health as something that makes us eat less, which I think for a lot of people that is what we need. But again, it depends on the situation and it depends on the individual. And then likelihood for overconsumption goes hand in hand with concentration. So if something is easier to digest, typically we can consume it with more ease, right? So the cooking method matters. If something is more raw compared to something is really cooked down, it's going to be easier to consume more if it's cooked down in a soup versus if you're eating everything raw. The nutrient density matters. The water content matters, right? More nutrients, your body tends to feel satiated sooner than if the nutrients are, depleted from the food that you're getting. Your body's not going to have the same signals to say, okay, I'm full, because it wants those nutrients as a way to say, like, I've had enough, because the nutrients are a vital part of the energy that we're using food for. Water content is also very important for what our body needs, but it also has a satiating property that has no calories. Taste really matters, right? So if something tastes good, it's easier to overconsume it, even if it has more water content and has more nutrient density. I certainly know that's the case for me. If I just add the right seasoning to vegetables, I'm able to eat a lot more vegetables than if it's just sort of bland and watery. So those are some strategies you can use to consume more or consume less. Make it taste better, you'll typically consume more. If you want to consume less, you might need to get used to eating things that are a little bit more bland. And it's different for different people. Like, you have different strategies, but usually that's a pretty solid one. And then you can look at things that will happen when you taste food that you like. It'll change different neurotransmitter hormonal blood sugar responses. So neurotransmitters like dopamine will change when you eat certain foods, hormonal responses, blood sugar responses. Certainly, certain foods will have a quicker rise in blood sugar, which can have utility or not. Certainly for in long-term overconsumption, your blood sugar being high on a regular basis can lead to diagnoses like diabetes. So obviously not useful, but in certain occasions where you may need a quick increase in blood sugar, and in others you want it to be a little bit more sustained. So again, not good or bad, but oftentimes the narrative around food is a response to what the majority of our problems are. So if we look at, as a society, we tend to have more problems with obesity than we do with being underweight or being closer to a normal weight. So most of the narrative becomes about what foods allow us to consume less, and then they get made equivalent to healthy. But again, not necessarily healthy. It really depends on the situation. So if we look at supplements, the utility of supplements can be to find balance and enhancement for your micronutrients, which are your vitamins and minerals, or your macronutrients, which would be typically you're going to use supplements for things like protein, sometimes for fats, essential fats like fatty acids such as fish oil, which is giving us more omega-3s. That's become very common. You rarely see supplementation for carbohydrates nowadays, but some people may need to take some simple sugars, which help to promote more glycogen in the body for higher intensity efforts. So what you will see quite a bit is if you're doing a marathon or you're doing a long distance run where you need to give yourself some quick energy because you're depleting it with the effort that you're doing, then that's basically supplementation for quick carbohydrates. We can look at supplementation for mood, focus, energy enhancement, nootropics. You may use things, and this will start to blend into the drug conversation. You may use things like L-theanine for focus. Some people use nicotine specifically for focus, and we'll talk about that when we get into drugs. But there's supplementation to give you the right utility. But if you take it too much, it certainly could become addictive and problematic and lead to health problems down the line. And just like we said with food, there are short-term versus long-term considerations. And then the utility, again, would be based on a situation and the individual. It's not inherently right or wrong. The continuum here, if we look at the quantity, just like food, we can take too much or not enough as per studied normal ranges. Most of the time you can get a lot of the things that supplements are offering in food, but it's getting harder to do that, and we have to really appreciate what our lifestyles afford. So, the conversation about really being in tune with your body, using supplementations to balance that out, and then there's the judgmental conversation about saying we should be able to get everything from your food. Well, it depends on the person, it depends on the situation, depends on how in tune with your body you are, it depends on a lot of factors. So I'm not going to draw a line in the sand and say you should or shouldn't do anything. I think should is a loaded term. So it's having the more information, having more variables to manipulate, you could actually look at what's more useful for you. Blood work to me is an important factor here, because if you are going to take some supplementation, you want to have something to compare it to. So I'll give an example personally. I went through a nice blood panel that showed that I was more deficient than I thought I would be in omega-3s. So I started taking quite a bit more omega-3s, eating more fish, and got blood work back, and it helped. So it's like, okay, that's useful. So I probably should get blood work done at least quarterly now to look at that. But just in this short term, over the course of 4 months of trying to make that change, blood work confirmed to me that I was doing something that was useful in those moments. And I was taking my nutrition seriously. I was eating quite a bit of fish, but I looked like I needed a little bit of supplementation according to the blood work, and it seems to have helped, again, according to the blood work. So you have to have some type of metric that you're looking at to see, like, is what I'm taking useful? Because you're not always going to get signals from the body that tells you what you're taking is useful or not. And I think this happens quite a bit with supplementation, where you don't get any notice that what you're doing is useful, and some of the supplementation you might be taking is not regulated in a manner that the ingredients that are labeled on the bottle are actually in there. So there's a lot of variables there. So to me, blood work's an important part of looking at how much quantity of the supplements you're taking is useful. There are minimal regulations for appropriate dosage, ingredients, and bioavailability, because companies can bring a product to market without any FDA approval. So you can be a company and you're just putting something out there, and it may not have in it what it says it has in it. So you just have to do your due diligence there, be an informed consumer. One of the ways to be an informed consumer is to get some blood work. So another factor here is the uncertainty of the value versus what you get from food. And what can start to happen is that it just seems easier, because we're trying to isolate out the things that supplements give us as, okay, this is what I need for my body for health. And we become overly reliant on supplementation, and we forget about trying to get a lot of this stuff from food, and then having our nutrition be a little bit more balanced. So I think that's just something to be careful with, is that supplementation can be quite useful, but it's not the same thing as food. And we want to use it as that it's a supplement to our food. It doesn't become what we consume and rely on more than we rely on what we put in our mouth from a food perspective. The concentration here also becomes something that's very important here. So the dosage per pill, per liquid, whatever route of administration you're taking your supplementation, you have to know that, and that could really matter. The units always matter here too. So you want to know how much you're taking per pill. You have to really pay attention to that, being an informed consumer. Typically, when we're looking at drugs and pharmacology, this is super important, but you usually have, hopefully, a physician to help you through that process. And you want somebody helping you through that process, in my opinion. So it's a little harder to do that with supplementation. You have to trust the manufacturers. You have to trust the labeling. And there's reasons to be a little bit more skeptical of supplements than there are of prescription drugs. That's debatable, I guess, with how big pharma works, but not really going to get into that debate right now. But there's certainly, I think, some regulations, and more regulations tend to be better than less when it comes to looking at having more protections there. And outside of the regulations from the major companies, I think having something that you legally have to have supervision from a medical professional, I think that's the key. And there's so many things that are over the counter that you don't need any type of feedback or supervision from a medical professional. It kind of gives you a sense that things are safer than they appear. And that's not necessarily the case. So you can absolutely take too much from a quantity standpoint, from a concentration and dosage standpoint, from supplementation or over-the-counter medicines, and you have no supervision by medical professionals. I think you just have to be way more cautious there and appreciate just because something is not through a prescription doesn't mean you can take it like candy. It doesn't mean it's safe to take at high quantities. So follow whatever the package says, but certainly consult with a physician even when it comes to things that don't have to be prescribed. And then the likelihood of overconsumption, similar discussion here is like there's minimal feedback from the body for an ideal dose. So you won't necessarily know if you're taking too much until you get some symptoms down the line, and that could be problematic if you start getting symptoms that you're taking too much. Taking too little, again, that should be something that blood work can tell you. Certainly, if you're getting any type of symptoms of low energy, then you can talk to your physician about it. And then usually the step that will be taken from the physician is to give you blood work so you have more information about some things that you might need supplementation for. And again, pills, liquids, these are easily consumed. We talked about food. There's certain things within food like fiber content, water content, certain nutrients that you're getting that make it actually harder to consume more. You don't get that with supplementation. You usually don't get that with drugs. So it's very easy to consume too much if you're not paying attention. And again, I talked about there's no need for supervision from a medical professional. So, that could be risky. If we look at drugs now, similar discussion to supplementation, but I think quite a bit more dangerous here, and quite a bigger spectrum of utility to something that could be very life-altering in a negative way. But if we look at why do we take drugs, pain control, social mood enhancement, anxiety control, something that's anti-pathogenic, so antimicrobial, kill some type of pathogen that could be causing problems within your system. And then we have some drugs that might facilitate body systems or inhibit body systems. So we can purposely want to be inhibiting respiration or cardiovascular function in a short term for certain procedures. You think about all the things that anesthesiologists have to do and all the education they have to be able to basically sedate someone to have a major surgery done. All of those things, medicine is involved in that and very necessary. And some of the things that are most dangerous that are out in street drugs might be used by anesthesiologists in a very specific and precise manner, in a very necessary manner to allow us to do surgeries that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So again, that just kind of puts things in a perspective here, or this continuum idea of some of the things that we've likely all had some experience with people that have died of drug overdoses or are in the throes of drug addiction. One of the worst things I know I've ever experienced in my life with people that I know, family members, myself, it can be something that's terrible. And that's, one end of the spectrum. But those same drugs that we can villainize are used by medical professionals in a very precise manner to sometimes save lives or certainly enhance lives by allowing certain medical procedures to be done in a way that is more tolerable for the patient and the individual. So I just want that to be clear here. Like I'm certainly taking the negative side of this very seriously, where what can happen when drugs are used in a manner that is harmful. It could be one of the worst things, certainly, again, the worst thing I've ever experienced in my life with people I know and certain things I've gone through myself. But we don't have to look at the chemical that got individuals there as a villain. We have to put it in a continuum of it can have utility, where does it have utility, and where can it be quite dangerous. So again, there's short-term, long-term considerations here. And just like with food, just like with supplementations, the utility varies based on the situation and the individual. And the situation here, to me, is how much supervision are there from people that are educated in order to use this stuff, because it's serious. So if we look at the continuum here, when we're looking at quantity, we have to start understanding with certain drugs that there's a lethal dose. We have to understand things like dosage, frequency, and hopefully they're prescribed by a healthcare professional in most cases. All right, and regulations are going to vary based on legality. So if we're talking about prescription drugs, there's going to be a lot more regulation. If we're talking about illegal drugs, there's no regulations because you're doing it illegally, right? And in many ways, you're going to have to work around the criminal justice system, which becomes much more problematic because you don't necessarily know what you're getting in the drug that you're taking. So obviously, we know some of the harms there. The fentanyl crisis now is people aren't attempting to take fentanyl, but they're dying from fentanyl because they think they're taking something else that has fentanyl in it. And we look at things like concentration. There's much more ease of having a lethal dose being consumed or administered if we get the dosage wrong, if we get the units wrong. So fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than something like morphine, because we're looking at things being measured in micrograms versus milligrams. And that's something, again, that a anesthesiologist or someone who's very skilled and very educated on the use of these drugs will know very well and be able to measure out very well. But if it's happening on the street, you're not going to be able to have that trust in the accuracy of the drug that's being made. And it will literally kill you when you're taking something like that you thought might be helping you study. So it's just that's the danger out there, but that danger is still within a continuum of quantity and concentration, as opposed to the drug itself having no utility. Well, it does have utility. It's very dangerous if you get it wrong. And then we can look at the likelihood of overconsumption, and here is where things like addiction come into play. But an addiction in itself is, it's a term, it's discussed as a noun, but I would look at that more as a process, and it has its own continuum of the utility. You can admittedly have an addiction to something, but it's not harming your life in a way where other things could be totally ruining your life. So you look at caffeine, I would say most people that I know, most of the country is addicted to caffeine in some way, and has different strategies for dealing with how much caffeine they consume. But caffeine for some can be quite useful in their productivity in life. And then there's a debate to say, well, are we reliant on it? Are we dependent on it? Yeah, you might become that, but it's certainly quite a different thing than having some type of addiction to heroin or alcohol, where we really see the negative effects, or even something that has less acute negative effects like nicotine and smoking, but we know the long-term effects are absolutely lethal. So we don't have that same evidence of caffeine being negative in that same way. But these are all drugs, and they're all commonly consumed drugs. So the likelihood of overconsumption might be equivalent in some of these situations, but the drug just isn't as negative. The utility of it can be greater, or the negative effect of overconsumption may not be as high for some drugs as others. With my experience, I overconsumed alcohol for a good portion, like about 10 years, going from like 16 to 26. And it was a gradual buildup, but I was still able to function pretty well as a human. I was able to graduate from school with a master's degree, but I definitely overconsumed alcohol on a regular basis. And any night, the short-term effects could have been dire, could have been my last night, because I just did not have a good control over how I was managing risk when I was consuming alcohol. I just look back at that situation as, was I an addict? Do I have to use that terminology? If it's useful, and it was at a certain point of my process of giving it up, but it ceased to be later on in the process, where now I'm 15 years from doing that. So I'm actually without alcohol longer than I was with it. It's no longer useful to consider myself an addict. It's just something I don't do. And I think there is a continuum there of saying, how do you feel the even terminology, the identity of being an addict works for you to do something that had very little positive utility for you. So if I looked at the positive utility of alcohol, well, it was definitely a social lubricant. It made me feel more comfortable in more situations. I was young and immature, but I looked at it as something that it made me bond better with friends. It made me bond better with people that in other circumstances wouldn't have been my friend. I just felt more connected to more people. So in the short term, that's a great thing. That sounds like a great thing. We all know the downside of the long-term effects. We also know, even in those short-term situations where the beginning of a night can be very tame, where the end of a night can be very dangerous, right? So that's how alcohol affected me. It doesn't affect everybody like that. So to, again, look at alcohol as a villain to me would be ignorant on my part, or it'd just be my situation. It was certainly not useful, and any utility that I had in the short term was certainly being worn away, and it was getting in the way of relationships, and it was getting in the way of productivity. And without it, the contrast is pretty stark, where I feel like it sort of took the emergency brake off of productivity, relationships, and just opening up doors for things that I think would have been closed without it. But that's just a personal experience there, and I certainly don't want to let my experience be something that I'm trying to put on anybody else. And one of the reasons that I'm doing a podcast like this is because of those experiences, and the people that I know that have had issues with alcohol, issues with drugs. They all have a different experience, and I have found that there is some lack of utility that I see with the over-identification of somebody who's having a difficult time in any one moment with a drug being labeled as a diagnosis. And then that labeling often gets painted negatively as that they have a problem that the rest of the population doesn't have. So now, if you admit that you want to change something, you have to go through that stigma of having a problem. Where if you look at it from another perspective, if you make a choice to change a habit or a behavior, and you do that successfully, you've done something good. You've done something really good. You don't have a problem. You have done something that a lot of other people can't do. So it's not that you had more of a problem than the rest of the population. We don't have to compare. It's not, some type of contest where someone tolerates something better than others. It's just you've made a choice. You've seen something that has a lack of utility in your life, and you've made a choice to try to change it. And that's not a diagnosis that should be pathologized. That is something, to me, that is something that should be celebrated. So looking at some of this idea of drugs and food and anything we consume, that certainly can be done to a point where it becomes not so useful. But if we look at it and we always keep it in that process, then we will have less judgment of others who have made a change. And we actually might start to celebrate people, not in a way that we're calling them heroic for just making a change, right? It's just that they're making a positive change in some moment, and that change is always in process. So whether you want to hold on to something that I have a pathology, so therefore I always have to keep in the front of my mind that I can't do this. I can't go back to this chemical, or I'll go back to that life. That may absolutely hold great utility for many people, because it is a reminder that I don't want to go back to that life. But there is a certain point in time where, as a society, we have to stop viewing somebody who gives something up as they had a problem, that's why they had to give it up. No, it's just if we're open to change on a regular basis, then giving up alcohol, even bringing our use down of any drug in to make it a more moderate use, all of that is part of what is possible in this continuum. And we have to hold all of these variables in a process so that we really appreciate all the utility that could come from some things, but certainly many of the dangers that can come from either overconsumption or getting concentration that's greater than we expected in any one night. That might be the end of things, and we can't come back from that. So hopefully that was useful. Please ask questions if you have any questions here. I'd like to try to respond to questions to make these conversations more specific to what the audience is feeling and wants to know about. But hopefully these continuum discussions are helpful. They're really important to me because that is the way that that I certainly think about healthcare, to try to take out a lot of the judgment that actually limits people from trying to make change because they don't want to be viewed as something. Instead of just saying like, okay, this change that you would make would be more useful in your life if we broke it down into this continuum-based thought process. It would become more clear, and I think it would become more logical to make changes. But a lot of times judgment gets in the way of that because we don't want to be identified as something that we might have been judging somebody else about. I'll see you next time.